January 1945, southwestern Germany. The frozen edge of the Reich. The snow fell in silence over the shattered village of Forbach, near the French-German border. It was the kind of silence that follows artillery fire, heavy, unnatural, as if the earth itself had lost its voice. Among the rubble of what had once been a postal station, a woman in a torn Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform sat with her back against a collapsed stone wall. Her name was Greta Hartmann, 23 years old, a signals operator for the retreating 19th Army. Her hands, blue with cold, clutched a piece of bread she had stolen 3 days earlier. She had not eaten it. She was saving it, though for what, she no longer knew. Around her, the sounds of the American advance echoed through the frozen streets, the grind of tank treads, the shouts in English, the crackling of radios. She did not run. There was nowhere left to run. The Reich that had promised her glory, that had told her she was building a new world, had abandoned her in a snowdrift on the edge of oblivion. She waited for the Americans as one waits for an executioner. When the Gs of the 3rd Infantry Division found her, she did not resist. She expected a bullet. She expected vengeance. What she did not expect was the urgency in their voices, the rough gentleness of their hands as they lifted her from the snow. And when one of them, a tall corporal from Ohio named Robert, Dunham, scooped her into his arms and began carrying her toward the field medical station, she whispered in broken English the only question her frozen mind could form. "Why are you carrying me?" He did not answer. He only walked faster. To understand the bewilderment in Greta Hartmann's question, one must first understand the world she had been taught to believe in. The Germany of 1945 was not the Germany of 1939. 6 years of total war had not merely exhausted the nation, it had hollowed it out, body and soul. But the ideology that had driven that war, the twisted gospel preached by the National Socialist regime, had not died with the soldiers in Stalingrad or the civilians in Hamburg. It had burrowed deep into the minds of millions, shaping their expectations, their fears, and their understanding of the enemy. Greta Hartmann had been 17 when the war began. She had joined the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps in 1943, not out of fanaticism, but out of necessity. Her father had been killed at Kursk. Her mother had died in the bombing of Stuttgart. The military offered food, shelter, and purpose. But it also offered something else, a narrative. The Americans, she had been told, were gangsters and capitalists, a mongrel nation of Jews and Negroes and criminals, driven by greed and incapable of honor. They would rape and murder. They would torture prisoners. They would desecrate everything the Reich held sacred. This was not propaganda, unique to Greta. It was the official doctrine disseminated through every Wehrmacht briefing, every Hitler Youth rally, every broadcast of the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment. Joseph Goebbels had spent years constructing an image of the American soldier as a brutish savage, more dangerous than the Soviets because he hid his barbarism behind a veneer of civilization. German soldiers and civilians alike were conditioned to believe that capture by the Americans meant death or worse. The irony, of course, was that this propaganda was a mirror image of the truth. It was the Wehrmacht that had committed atrocities on an industrial scale. It was the SS that had turned murder into policy. But in the closed loop of Nazi ideology, the enemy was always the monster. The enemy was always the aggressor. And so when Greta Hartmann saw the Americans approaching through the snow, she believed she was staring at her own death. Instead, she found herself being carried. The moment of first contact between German POWs and American forces was, for many, a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. The records are filled with accounts of German soldiers and civilians who, upon capture, could not reconcile what they had been told with what they were experiencing. Corporal Dunham's decision to carry Greta Hartmann was not an isolated act of heroism. It was standard procedure. The U.S. Army's policy toward POWs, codified in the Geneva Convention and reinforced by military doctrine, was clear. Prisoners were to be treated humanely, provided with medical care, and protected from harm. This was not merely a matter of law. It was a matter of ideology. The United States entered the Second World War with a self-image rooted in democratic principles and moral righteousness. American soldiers were taught that they were fighting not for conquest, but for liberation. They were taught that they represented a different kind of power, one that did not brutalize the defeated, but offered them a path back to humanity. This was not naivete. It was strategy. The Allies understood that the treatment of POWs would shape the post-war order. But it was also belief. The majority of American soldiers genuinely saw themselves as the good guys. Greta Hartman could not have known this. As Corporal Dunham carried her through the snow, her mind raced with confusion and terror. She tried to speak, to ask again why he was helping her, but her throat was too dry, her voice too weak. She felt the strength in his arms, the steadiness of his stride. She felt the cold air on her face and the warmth of his body heat seeping through his uniform. And slowly, against every instinct she had been trained to follow, she stopped struggling. The field medical station was a converted barn on the outskirts of the village. Inside, kerosene heaters fought against the January cold. Medics moved between rows of wounded soldiers, American and German alike, administering morphine, stitching wounds, calling out for plasma. Dunham laid Greta on a stretcher and stepped back as a medic knelt beside her. The medic was a young man from Brooklyn, barely older than Greta herself. He spoke to her in halting German, asking where she was hurt. She stared at him, unable to answer. He checked her pulse, her breathing, her extremities. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and handed her a canteen of water. "Drink," he said in English. Then in German, "Trinken." She drank. The water was cold and clean, and it tasted like a miracle. The American abundance that German POWs encountered was not limited to medical care. It extended to every aspect of captivity, and it was this abundance, more than any speech or pamphlet, that began to crack the ideological foundations of Nazi belief. Food, in particular, became a symbol of American power and a source of profound psychological impact. By January 1945, Germany was starving. The collapse of supply lines, the Allied bombing campaign, and the diversion of resources to the Eastern Front had created a famine that affected soldiers and civilians alike. The average German soldier's ration had been reduced to 1,500 calories per day, often less. Bread was mixed with sawdust. Meat was a memory. Hunger was constant, gnawing, and demoralizing. American soldiers, by contrast, were among the best-fed troops in history. The U.S. Army's logistical network delivered not just food, but variety: canned meat, chocolate bars, white bread, coffee, cigarettes, fruit cocktail. The infamous K-ration, often mocked by American troops as bland and monotonous, contained more protein and fat than a German soldier saw in a week. And when German POWs were fed the same rations as their captors, the effect was staggering. Greta Hartman's first meal in American custody was a K-ration, box handed to her by a supply sergeant who spoke no German and seemed to regard the entire process as routine. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside, a can of beef stew, crackers, a chocolate bar, a packet of instant coffee, sugar, cigarettes, and chewing gum. She stared at it for a long moment, convinced it was a trick. But the other prisoners around her were already eating, their faces slack with disbelief and gratitude. She opened the can of stew and ate slowly, methodically, trying to make it last. The meat was real. The fat was real. The warmth in her stomach was real. It was more food than she had seen in 3 months. This was not an isolated experience. Records from POW camps across Europe document the same pattern. German prisoners, upon receiving American rations, experienced a kind of ideological whiplash. They had been told that America was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse. They had been told that the German soldier was superior in every way. But here was evidence to the contrary, evidence that could not be denied because it could be tasted, chewed, and swallowed. The Americans were not starving. The Americans were not desperate. The Americans had so much food that they could afford to give it away to their enemies. For many German POWs, this was the first crack in the wall of propaganda. If the regime had lied about American weakness, what else had it lied about? The journey from the front lines to the POW camps was, for German prisoners, a journey through a looking glass. Everything they had been taught was inverted. The Americans did not execute prisoners. They did not torture them. They did not separate officers from enlisted men for special punishment. Instead, they processed them with bureaucratic efficiency. Photographs, fingerprints, medical exams, delousing, new clothes. The camps themselves, though far from luxurious, were clean, organized, and safe. Prisoners slept in heated barracks. They received medical care. They were allowed to write letters home. Greta Hartmann was transferred to a women's POW facility near Reims, France, in early February 1945. The facility was a repurposed factory, guarded by American MPs and staffed by female Red Cross workers. There were 200 women there, most of them Wehrmacht auxiliaries like Greta signals operators, clerks, nurses. The routine was simple. Roll call at dawn, breakfast, work detail, lunch, free time, dinner, lights out. The work was light laundry, kitchen duty, basic maintenance. No one was beaten. No one was starved. What unsettled Greta most was not the conditions, but the attitude of the guards. They were polite. They were bored. They treated the prisoners not as enemies, but as an administrative burden. There was no hatred in their eyes, no cruelty in their voices. They handed out cigarettes and magazines. They made jokes she did not understand. They seemed, in a way that Greta found deeply disturbing, indifferent. This indifference was, in its own way, a kind of power. The Americans did not need to brutalize their prisoners because they did not fear them. They had already won. The war was over in all but name, and everyone knew it. The prisoners were not a threat. They were paperwork. For Greta, the realization came slowly, in fragments. It came when she tasted her first cup of American coffee, bitter, strong, and abundant. It came when she saw the Red Cross packages arriving every week, filled with soap and toothpaste and chocolate. It came when she heard, through the camp grapevine, that the war in Europe had ended, that Hitler was dead, that the Reich had surrendered unconditionally. She did not believe it at first. But then the guards confirmed it, casually, as if it were old news. The war was over. She had survived. And the Americans, who were supposed to have killed her, had saved her instead. The psychological transformation, experienced by German POWs in American custody, was documented extensively by U.S. military psychologists and intelligence officers. The goal was not merely humanitarian, it was strategic. The Allies understood that the rebuilding of Germany would require the denazification of millions of people, and that process could begin in the POW camps. Through a combination of humane treatment, access to uncensored news, and educational programs, the Americans sought to break down the ideological barriers erected by 12 years of Nazi rule. The results were mixed but significant. Surveys conducted in POW camps in 1945 and 1946 showed that while hardcore Nazi loyalists remained resistant, the majority of prisoners experienced a shift in their worldview. Many expressed shame and confusion. They had believed in the Führer. They had believed in the cause. But the evidence of their own eyes, the food, the medicine, the fair treatment, contradicted everything they had been taught. And when they were shown footage of the concentration camps, when they were forced to confront the reality of what had been done in their name, the cognitive dissonance became unbearable. Greta Hartmann attended one of the camp screenings in June 1945. The film was a montage of footage from Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Buchenwald. She watched in silence as the camera panned over piles of emaciated corpses, over walking skeletons in striped uniforms, over the bulldozers pushing bodies into mass graves. The room was silent except for the whir of the projector. Some of the women wept. Some turned away. Greta sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her face blank. Afterward, a Red Cross worker asked if anyone wanted to talk about what they had seen. No one spoke. The silence was heavier than the film. That night, Greta lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the bread she had been saving in Forbach, the bread she had never eaten. She thought about the propaganda posters she had seen as a girl, the heroic soldiers, the glowing future, the promises of greatness. She thought about Corporal Dunham carrying her through the snow, his face tense with urgency, his breath clouding in the frozen air. Why are you carrying me? She understood now. He had carried her because that was what his country had taught him to do. Not because she deserved it. Not because she was innocent. But because she was human, and humans deserved care. It was a simple idea, almost childishly simple. But it was an idea that had never existed in the world she came from. The contrast between American and Nazi ideology was not merely philosophical, it was material. The United States, protected by two oceans and blessed with vast natural resources, had built an economy capable of sustaining a global war without collapsing its civilian standard of living. American factories produced tanks, planes, ships, and munitions at a rate that staggered the imagination. In 1944 alone, the U.S. manufactured over 96,000 aircraft, 17,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of steel. At the same time, American civilians enjoyed a level of prosperity that would have seemed obscene to a starving German populace. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of a system democratic capitalism that rewarded innovation, encouraged competition, and distributed wealth more broadly than any totalitarian regime could ever manage. The Nazis had promised prosperity through conquest. The Americans had achieved it through production. And when German POWs encountered that abundance firsthand, the ideological implications were impossible to ignore. Greta Hartmann was released from POW custody in November 1945. She was given a set of civilian clothes, a train ticket to Stuttgart, and a document certifying her denazification. The city she returned to was a moonscape of rubble. Her childhood home no longer existed. The street where she had played as a girl was a crater. She found work as a clerk in the occupation office, processing paperwork for the American military government. The Americans paid her in occupation marks and gave her access to the PX, where she could buy things she had not seen since before the war. Butter, eggs, soap, nylon stockings. She did not think of herself as collaborating. She thought of herself as surviving. But survival, in the new Germany, meant accepting the reality that the Americans had won not just the war, but the argument. They had proven that democracy could outproduce dictatorship, that freedom could outfight tyranny, and that a nation built on the idea that all people are created equal could defeat a nation built on the idea that some people are meant to rule. The symbolic object that haunted her, the one that returned to her in dreams and idle moments, was that first ration box. She remembered the weight of it in her hands, the smell of the beef stew, the sweetness of the chocolate. She remembered thinking, this is what they can afford to give away. This is what they consider ordinary. It was not the propaganda films or the re-education lectures that changed her. It was that box. The urgency that Corporal Dunham had felt, the urgency that Greta Hartmann had not understood, was not personal. It was cultural. The American soldier carried his enemy to safety because he had been raised in a society that valued human life, even enemy life, as something worth preserving. This was not universal. There were atrocities committed by American troops, moments of rage and revenge. But the prevailing ethic, the institutional norm, was one of restraint and humanity. This ethic was rooted in the American experience of democracy. The United States was not a perfect nation. It had its own sins: slavery, segregation, the internment of Japanese Americans. But it was also a nation that believed, however imperfectly, in the idea of progress. It believed that people could change, that societies could improve, that the future did not have to be a repetition of the past. This belief shaped its conduct in war and its plans for peace. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, was the ultimate expression of this ideology. Instead of punishing Germany into permanent poverty, the United States invested billions of dollars in rebuilding the shattered nation. It was an act of enlightened self-interest. A prosperous Europe was a stable Europe, but it was also an act of faith. The Americans believed that given the right conditions, given food and shelter and opportunity, even the Germans could become democrats. Greta Hartmann lived to see the success of that experiment. She married an engineer from Munich in 1950. She had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and raised them in a Germany that, by the 1960s, was almost unrecognizable from the one she had grown up in. The rubble had been cleared. The cities had been rebuilt. The economy was booming. Her children never knew hunger. They never knew dictatorship. They grew up in a democracy, and they took it for granted. She told them, once, about the day the Americans found her in Forbach. She told them about Corporal Dunham carrying her through the snow. She told them about the confusion she had felt, the question she had asked, "Why are you carrying me?" Her son, 14 years old and restless with adolescent certainty, asked, "What did he say?" "Nothing," Greta replied. "He didn't say anything. He just carried me." Her son frowned. "But why?" She smiled, a sad, distant smile. "Because that's what they do." The story of Greta Hartmann is not unique. Thousands of German POWs experienced the same bewilderment, the same slow erosion of ideology in the face of American abundance and American decency. But her story encapsulates something essential about the nature of that conflict, not just the military struggle, but the clash of ideas. The Second World War was not only a war of armies and borders. It was a war of systems, of worldviews, of competing visions of what a society should be. The Nazis believed in hierarchy, in the supremacy of the strong, in the inevitability of conflict. They built a state designed for war and fed it a mythology of destiny. But that mythology crumbled when it encountered a different kind of power, a power rooted not in brutality, but in productivity. Not in fear, but in freedom. The Americans who fought in Europe were not saints. They were ordinary men, many of them draftees, who wanted nothing more than to go home. But they carried with them the values of a society that, for all its flaws, believed in the possibility of a better world. And when they extended that belief to their enemies, when they carried them through the snow and fed them and treated them as human beings, they won a victory that no amount of firepower could have achieved. Greta Hartmann died in 1998, at the age of 76. She was buried in a quiet cemetery outside Stuttgart, surrounded by the children and grandchildren of a generation that had rebuilt Germany from the ashes. At her funeral, her daughter read a passage from a letter Greta had written late in life, addressed to no one in particular. "I have thought often about that day in the snow. I have thought about the American who carried me. I do not know his name. I do not know if he survived the war. But I know that in that moment, he showed me something I had never seen before: mercy without expectation, kindness without motive. He did not carry me because I deserved it. He carried me because I was there and I needed help." That is the difference. That is what I failed to understand then, and what I have spent the rest of my life trying to live up to. The piece of bread she had saved in Forbach, the bread she never ate, she never forgot it. It became, in her memory, a symbol of scarcity, of the world the Nazis had built. But the key ration box, the chocolate bar, the canteen of clean water, those became symbols of something else. They became proof that abundance is possible, that generosity is possible, that a nation can be strong without being cruel. That is the lesson she carried with her for the rest of her life. That is the lesson her children carried into the new Germany. That is the lesson the Americans, perhaps without fully realizing it, taught the world. History is not made only of battles and treaties. It is made of moments, small human moments, that reveal the gulf between competing visions of the world. The question Greta Hartmann asked in the snow, "Why are you carrying me?" was not just a question about one man's actions. It was a question about the meaning of power, about the purpose of victory, about what a nation chooses to do when it holds the lives of its enemies in its hands. The Americans chose mercy. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough that it changed the world. And in the end, that choice, that urgency to save rather than destroy, to rebuild rather than ruin, became the foundation of the post-war order. It became the reason that Greta Hartmann lived to see her grandchildren grow up in a democracy. The reason that Germany became a partner rather than a pariah. The reason that the second half of the 20th century, for all its conflicts, did not descend into another total war. The snow has long since melted in Forbach. The rubble has been cleared. The barn that served as a field hospital is gone. But the memory remains, passed down through families, recorded in archives, preserved in the quiet knowledge that in the darkest hour of the 20th century, a soldier from Ohio carried an enemy through the snow and asked nothing in return. That is what democracy looks like. Not in the grand speeches or the soaring rhetoric, but in the small acts of human decency that refuse to accept cruelty as inevitable. That is the inheritance of the generation that fought the Second World War. That is the answer to the question Greta Hartmann asked in the snow. Why are you carrying me? Because you are human. Because I am human. Because that is what we do.